This is Beyond Crude, a Stop EACOP campaign podcast series that explores the economic, social, and governance impact in Uganda and Tanzania. Joining us in studio here in Nairobi is Richard and Colleen, and also joining us via Zoom is Isabel. Welcome to this conversation, which will be part of a series of conversations around EACOP, its impact, especially on the environment, the social and cultural issues around it. And joining me to have this conversation, we'll start with the guest to our right.
My name is Colleen Scott. I work for a non-governmental organization called Inclusive Development International, or IDI, and we're a global human rights organization that supports communities around the world to defend their rights in the face of harmful investment projects. And we do that by following the money behind these harmful projects to identify where is the funding coming from and where are the pressure points for advocacy. And we've been involved in this work around the EACOP since about 2017.
Thank you. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, happy to be here.
My name is Richard Senkondo. I work with the Organization for Community Engagement, OC. It's a local NGO based in Tanzania, and I am a community member for the Stop EACOP campaign. Mainly our organization advocates for human rights violations and the environmental degradation, and particularly since 2020, we have been active in mobilizing community, demanding their rights, particularly the right to own properties, which we consider they have been mostly violated by EACOP, and also the likelihood of environmental degradation, particularly climate change, impacts of climate change that are likely to be increased by EACOP.
Thank you. Isa?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Isabelle Héritier. I'm a campaigner and organizer at the Sunrise Project, which is a global network, so a non-governmental organization that basically gathers change makers and movements across the globe who are passionate about changing the world and specifically shifting our societies away from fossil fuel towards a just transition. And specifically, I campaign on insurance companies.
Thank you. Glad to have you. Just getting started, Colleen. You said follow the money. Very key. On this East Africa crude oil project, which are the major banks involved? Who are the investors involved? And what roles are they playing in essentially bringing this project to the communities?
Sure. So to give you a very clear picture, let me go back to 2017 when my organization first became involved in this case. So we got a request from Ugandan organizations working around Lake Albert, at the time supporting fishermen primarily who were being harmed by oil exploration activities at the time. And they requested our support to do this follow the money research, to look into this project, look at which companies are involved, who are the key investors in those companies, where is the money coming from. And when we did that research, we identified a few very critical pressure points. So the first is that the oil fields themselves were dependent on an export pipeline, what's now known as the East African Crude Oil Pipeline. So together with those partners in Uganda, we decided to focus a lot of the advocacy efforts on the pipeline itself as the critical sort of puzzle piece that needs to be in place in order for oil sector development in Uganda to fully develop. Now, then we looked at the pipeline's funding structure. And what we found is that the project developers plan to fund this project with what's called a 60% debt to 40% equity split. What that means is 40% of the total project cost, which is now estimated at $5 billion US dollars, 40% of that will come from equity from the project developers. That includes Total from France, CNOOC, which is a China National Offshore Oil Corporation. It's a majority state-owned Chinese company. And then the national oil companies of Uganda and Tanzania. Each of those entities holds an ownership stake in the pipeline. Now, 60% of the total project cost is supposed to come in the form of debt. And what that means is essentially a project loan from commercial banks, export credit agencies, development finance institutions, potentially, essentially a big loan covering 60% of the total cost of the $5 billion project.
Interesting. When you think about it, when you have Sina in there, you have Total in there, and yet 80% of essentially this project is in the Tanzanian side of the border. So the impact is beginning on this Lake Albert all the way to the port in Tanga. How does that look like in terms of the impact you're already seeing in the communities involved along the route all the way to the port?
Yeah, so in Tanzania, actually, since 2018, it was the first evaluation of properties began. So in all of the press, which they did evaluation in 2018 and 2019, eventually they banned the project-affected communities, which we often refer them as PAPs in abbreviation. So they banned them from not developing the properties with a caution that, or with an alert that the project would have started immediately. So unfortunately, the project couldn't start as how it was expected, and this project-affected person now couldn't engage in production, of where I can say the project will pass in most of rural areas just to avoid maybe the impacts and the major compensation in urban centers. So with the picture that is a project casts large area in rural areas where majority, with more than 70%, the rural population of Tanzania depends on crop cultivation for their survival. So these people, when they were banned from not developing their lands, mean that they were banned from cultivating major crops and for food and for cash. So typically they were just affected in terms of food, but also household income. But on top of that, when the grievances continued, they allowed them to cultivate, we call those short season crops that at least do not take more than 6 months until the time of harvest. But they were cultivating in smaller pieces of land, and often cash crops requires more than 6 months until the time of being harvested. They did not have that chance of cultivating. So the impacts are really evident in terms of food availability, but also the household income in general. Households were impacted.
Yeah, I mean, that's massive because it's significant number of populations around the entire stretch. And I mean, coming to you, Issa, these are the kind of things that usually when you undertake a project, they have to be taken into account from the start. So, I mean, in your view, what due diligence have these funders, undertaken to evaluate these kinds of, community and climate impacts that Richard is talking about? Were they done? Were they dismissed? What's the status? Lisa, coming to you.
Yes. So on due diligence, normally the financial companies that are going to be supporting a project and also the governments need to assess all the different elements of risks that a project coming into a community would pose. So we're talking about the risks on the ecosystem, the environmental risks, the climate risks, the risk on community livelihoods, the different elements that are basically the pros and the cons for a project to move ahead. And with that creates an overview of the project that they can present to the communities, that they can present to the local governments to be able to take the decision on if the project is being supported and moves ahead, or if there's adjustments that need to happen. And yeah, basically for the EACOP projects, often on fossil fuel projects like this, there's an accelerated process for a project to move ahead without necessarily a very profound and proper due diligence mechanism. And the campaign and the communities on the ground and the different groups involved in the Stop EACOP coalition have been working very hard for multiple years to really expose the different risks and then challenge companies, for example, financiers and insurance, to not support the projects, exposing that it wasn't respecting the due diligence that it was supposed to have and in their policies as well.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. And this then becomes part of, ICBC and, in a sense, once you have this information at hand, that this is the impact you're seeing, culturally, the displacement, the impact it's having on food cycles and the economic dynamics of it. What would be sort of, Colin, your sense of what best would have ICBC done once this become, the impact is now clear on the ground beyond the due diligence, which in essence has been ignored?
Well, so maybe actually going back to the first question you asked me about the identity of the different banks, I don't feel I fully answered that. So is it okay if I go back?
Sure. Yeah, we want to come back to that. So we can key it in. Yeah.
Okay, great. So in terms of which banks are involved in the project loan, that 60% debt component of the project, there's a few categories of financiers to keep in mind. The first category is institutions that we know are involved. So that includes the financial advisors to the project. From the beginning, there were 3 financial advisors. Those includes Standard Bank of South Africa, which is operating through a local Ugandan subsidiary called Stanbic Uganda. ICBC, which is a major Chinese bank. And then there was a Japanese bank called Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation, SMBC, that was also involved as a financial advisor from back, many years ago. They've been involved. But actually last year, SMBC announced that they were withdrawing their role as a financial advisor in the project, which was a major victory for the campaign. I mean, it's essentially unheard of that a financial advisor that has been involved for years in advising the project developers on how to get this project bankable, how to get it off the ground, how to get it funded. For them to withdraw at this point is a major, major victory and just speaks to the strength of the campaign. So those are the now two banks that are involved in their capacity as financial advisors. We're still waiting for confirmation about whether both of those two banks are going to actually put forth money for the project loan. We think it's quite likely at this stage, but they haven't yet publicly confirmed that they're actually lending to the project. But standard practice suggests that they would. Now, there are two other institutions that we know are involved, and that includes Afrexim Bank, which is a regional sort of development finance institution, as well as Islamic Development Bank, which is a similar type of development finance institution. Both of those banks collectively have committed a couple $100 million, which really is a drop in the bucket when you think of the size of the project loan that needs to be put forward for this project to get off the ground. And then there are the banks that we think could potentially lend to the project, but haven't yet confirmed. And so those at the moment are our big pressure points, trying to get them to make a public commitment that they won't lend to the project. And that includes, at this point, it's mostly major Chinese banks that have not yet made a public statement that they've ruled out support for the project. So those are certainly targets for the campaign. And then in addition to Chinese targets, we've heard in the media and other sources that the project developers are looking now to the Middle East as well. So potentially Middle Eastern banks. And really the turn to the Middle East and to China is a result of the success of the campaign in getting all of the major North American and European banks, or almost all of them, to publicly commit that they wouldn't fund this pipeline. So those are the banks that we know are involved.
Coming to Richard on that, how does this, funding and providing financial advisory to EACOP, clash with, ECG policies and the net zero commitment that a significant portion of, institutions within the, finance industry have adopted? Is it a contradiction? And then, how do they navigate that?
Yeah, actually, it is typically a contradiction. There is no doubt on that, because it is evident now from IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it has been saying that it is evident now fossil fuels now are the major key players on global warming that's also escalated climate change. So, and maybe actually we could expect part of their income maybe could be diverted just to fund renewable energy sources and the other clean source of energy. But unfortunately, it is coming now to fund the very, very controversial projects such as EACOP, which not only that is disturbing or deteriorating ecosystems and livelihood, but also typically it has just got massive impacts to the local communities. So I can just say they are typically really controversial, and they are not just adhering maybe also to the Paris Agreement, which actually is typically committed and tied to reduce the global temperature.
Interesting. Coming to you, Colleen.
Yeah, just to add to what Richard said, I mean, there are specific policies and standards that these banks and these insurance companies need to adhere to or have committed themselves to complying with. The first, obviously, is local law. These banks are not supposed to be lending to a project that's breaking Ugandan and Tanzanian law. As we know, there are numerous legal actions taking place in Uganda challenging irregularities in the project's implementation around land acquisition and the granting of environmental permits to the project. But above and beyond local law is international standards. And the project developers, so Total, CNOOC, the Chinese company, and the national oil companies of Uganda and Tanzania have publicly committed to adhering to international best practice standards for implementing this project. That includes a set of standards called the IFC Performance Standards. And these are a set of standards that guide, essentially, a company on how to effectively identify risks, environmental, social risks. That includes human rights use risks, climate risks, biodiversity risks. So to identify those and then to effectively manage them, so mitigate or prevent certain risks. And those standards come from the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank. In addition to the IFC performance standards, banks themselves that are providing project finance to a project, so in this case, it's a project loan, a certain number of banks have voluntarily committed to a set of standards called the Equator Principles, which are voluntary standards specifically for commercial banks lending to risky projects like EACOP. And those standards are based on the IFC performance standards. So they have the same requirements around, assessing and mitigating risks to communities, biodiversity and environmental risks, as well as, to a certain extent, climate risks. Now, the campaign has put a lot of work into effectively articulating how this project is at odds with those standards. So we've produced numerous reports. Baraka and Richard and others in the campaign have, gone on the ground and spoken with communities and interviewed them and gathered a lot of robust evidence to show that despite the fact that the companies say that they've undertaken due diligence, they've gotten all of the necessary approvals, in fact, what's happening on the ground is contrary to those international standards. Communities are suffering. Protected areas are at risk of pollution and potential oil spills. And there aren't, in fact, adequate safeguards to prevent or mitigate those risks.
Yeah, interesting. And just to build up on that, it's we're looking at ESG here, across the spectrum. Are there particular risks to these banks? Is there sort of some of them the defiance of the clear principles, both industry practices, but also the reports around the potential impact of EACOP and the choice to defy that and still go ahead and engage in the project? Are there risks to these banks in terms of their non-compliance to these international standards? Or are we at a place where we can say we are seeing the failure of, the IFCC and all these other industry compliance rules in terms of enforcement? Is there risks?
Yes, absolutely. There's numerous risks. And one of the big things the campaign has been doing is exposing those risks and challenging also the reputation of potential financiers and insurers that would support the project, despite the fact that the project and how it's been, proposed and not yet in operation, but moving ahead, doesn't respect these principles that Richard and Colleen have talked about. And the campaign has been so successful at challenging, documenting, and exposing the different financiers that could be potentially involved, that there's 27 global banks and 28 global insurers that have publicly refused to support EACOP. Many of them also explaining that the project didn't comply with their internal ESG policies, and that the project was too risky. And that would never have been possible if the campaign hadn't been that successful in really documenting, campaigning, exposing, challenging the reputation of financial actors that would be supporting and also pushing for alternatives. So I think it's really a showcase of the success of the campaign to show that for the moment, the project has been delayed for over 3 years and it's going quite good. And that's also a way that we can hold them accountable for their actions, to show that, they have guidance, they have guidelines they need to support. And if they're not doing the respect of them, then it's for us, the civil society, to hold them accountable.
Thank you for that. Just, Colleen, I want to take you back a bit on something you mentioned right at the beginning, which is when these farmers and the fishermen began to reach out to you, what were they telling you about their fears, or what were they noticing? And how did you go about sort of documenting that? And what exactly did you document to begin to speak to this EACOP challenge, basically?
Sure. So, I'm not the best person to answer this because I haven't been on the ground in Uganda speaking with the local communities. It would be best if we had a representative of Ugandan civil society in the room with us. Maybe Richard can speak to this a bit in the context of Tanzania. But at the time, back when we first were engaged in this case, as I said, it was primarily fisher folk that were being already harmed. And as I said, this was still at the sort of exploratory phase. So there was actually a third oil company involved at the time. It wasn't just Total and CNOOC. There was a British company called Tullow Oil that was also involved in exploratory drilling and looking at the feasibility of the project. Tullow has since divested from the project and withdrawn. But already at that point, which was a very early stage in the project's development, fisherfolk were communicating to Ugandan civil society about certain impacts around restricted access to their fishing areas. I believe there was pollution and even oil spills, even related to the preliminary exploratory drilling that was taking place around Lake Albert. But essentially, most of the fears were about the fact that all of these impacts were going to accumulate and worsen as the project moved ahead. So we saw what happened with the oil refinery, for example, in Uganda. Tens of thousands of people were evicted from their land to make way for this proposed oil refinery, which still is yet to see the light of day. So far, the Ugandan government has not found a company that's willing to build this oil refinery. And yet we saw that communities lost access to their farmland for years. There were disruptions in education at the community level. Certain children had to drop out of school for years, which has a lot of long-lasting impacts on the community. Ultimately, folks were either compensated and moved away from their traditional area or were relocated to a resettlement site, which had a lot of issues in terms of the adequacy and appropriateness of that resettlement site. So we saw that happen earlier in the 2010s with the oil refinery. And the concerns of the community were that these impacts were going to happen along the entire pipeline route, as well as within the two oil fields, the Tulenga and Kingfisher oil fields. And to be honest, that's exactly what we've seen. A lot of the same impacts in terms of disruption of education services, disruption of livelihoods, loss of access to farmland and other land to support communities' survival has taken place, not only around Lake Albert on the shores of the lake where the oil is being extracted or is proposed to be extracted, but also along the pipeline route throughout Uganda. And I'm sure Richard can speak to the situation in Tanzania.
Yeah, Richard, how does that look like on the other side of the border once it crosses out from Uganda?
So on the side of Tanzania, and particularly speaking to the fisherfolk, the majority who are actually impacted are those one in the Tanga port at Chongoleani, which will be the end point of EACOP from Uganda. So the area, in essence, is occupied by small-scale fishermen who actually use the local technology in doing their activities, that is fishing. So their boats are not powered by engines. So they normally fish just within 4 kilometers, I can say, to 5 kilometers just from the offshore. So when now Total and EACOP, they are right now building, we call it the oil jet, or the oil terminal where the tankers will be taking the oil. In all of that areas, actually, these small fishermen were evicted and they are not allowed to cross over there. So they have been shown another route to cross, actually, which is not friendly to their local boats. And by the way, they just use on those powered often by wind. So they move also just depending on the direction of wind. So that was the major impact. So including the impacts that I spoke previously, what actually we are doing, part of it is to empower local communities now to speak on themselves. Instead of not only as activists to speak on their behalf. We empower them, we capacitate them, we enlighten their knowledge on their human rights and the constitutional rights, and see what actually has been violated from various regulations, land regulations, other constitutional rights. So right now, they are even able to speak before the media. And what actually we have been doing, connecting them to the global community. We also assist journalists from various media stations, media houses. They come in Tanzania, so they talk directly to affected communities and they document. We have a few very interesting reports. We have the first one, I think it is titled EACOP, a disaster in making. You can get access to go and you can see it. And there are very recently released reports such as the Global Witness report. It's called Total, how it plays a role in reprisal of human rights activists and environmental defenders. So in those reports, if you happen to read them, they have documented a lot of impacts, significant impacts which are currently manifested on the side of Tanzania.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, it's good progress because when you're able to create that kind of synergy between the fisher folk, the local communities, the activists on the ground, and you're able to put this together, it's sort of beginning to take shape and you can see the impact of what you're doing. And I mean, coming to you, Issa, what have been, in your perspective, some of the milestones in trying to essentially get the concerned parties to stop the implementation of this project? What are some of those milestones that you've seen in terms of organizing?
Yeah, some of the main milestones have really been impressive. So the very solid local sensibilization and organizing on the ground to document what was happening around the exploration, the project coming in, to really expose to the communities what would be the impacts and what the communities were seeing on the ground, and really document that into reports and use it to pressure the potential institutions and financiers and insurers that would support the project that were being approached by Total and CNOOC. And so the main milestones were really around like how the campaign got structured in a local way with the communities on the ground, but also connecting to a global movement, so that the Stop EACOP International Coalition, and then the pressure being well coordinated on the ground, but also to the different institutions with activists across the world, pressuring financial institutions based in North America, Europe, Asia, because for a big project like this, you need international funding and support because it's such a huge project. So it's really been impressive to see the first different financial institutions saying no to the project, and then the domino effect and momentum of pressure when you get a first win to get more. And we've been seeing through not even like 3 years, major delays of the project because of this pullback, and also legal challenges. So what have been really impressive is like all the different ways in which the project is being challenged to not move ahead. So yeah, it's really like a combination of solid campaigning to get actors to stay away, and to show that also if they support the project, it's going to be major reputational risks for them.
Impressive. Richard?
So on the side of Tanzania, actually, I can say the major win is that right now local communities are on our side, are on the side of the Stop EACOP campaign. I can say that tracing back in the history, back then when President Museveni from Uganda and the late President Magufuli from Tanzania signed the deal, there were propagandas that were ongoing on the ground on the side of Tanzania. These were good promises on economic development at the country level, and to the individuals actually who sacrificed their land for the pipeline. They were promised good benefits, particularly on compensations. So I can just remember back then in 2018, 2019, when activists were trying to mobilize local communities, the project affected persons. The project affected persons were not like, what are you guys saying? The president has already told us we are going to benefit. And I can dare to say that they were reporting us to security agencies. So we have passed a really difficult time when the trouble time under President Magufuli. Now, later on, in 2022, late 2022, and in the beginning of 2023, last year, the compensations were started to be provided out. Now, the project affected persons came to realize what we are promised is not what we have realized, is not what has been put into our accounts. Eventually, they got low compensations and the delayed ones. For example, I said earlier that the first property evaluations were done in 2018 and 2019. Now, this project affected person in 2022 and 2023 were compensated based on all the figures that were assessed back in those previous years, 2018 and 2019. So the impact was that when they obtained those compensations, they went out again to search for similar same-size plot of land that they lost. Unfortunately, they couldn't get, because properties such as land is eventually known worldwide. The property never depreciates, but it appreciates. At that time, now they realized that they were cheated. The government played beyond them. Now they came to join the movement. Right now, I can say we have won because they are even able to travel beyond the borders of Tanzania. Whenever there are these convention meetings, workshops organized by the Stop EACOP Coalition, by various stakeholders, they are ready to go there. They even bring their documents as evidence of what was assessed and what they have just obtained. So for us, we consider it as a major win. And right now, as activists, I can say not activists alone, activists in collaboration with the project-affected persons. And also, we can see a little bit increase of activists and the civil society organizations that also previously were not supporting the campaign. They are now gradually coming into the space to advocate against the development of EACOP. So we are increasing efforts right now, joining the track of following where the money is coming from, continuing to put pressure on the banks, not to provide loans for the purpose of the upstream in exploration and extraction, but also key on the midstream where actually transportation and storage at that stage insurance are really hard needed. So we shall continue to put pressure. We shall continue to hold the actions to increase pressure on global insurance companies not to provide insurance to ensure that the crude doesn't flow from Uganda to Tanzania.
Yeah, that's quite some commendable progress. Colin?
Sure. So just to speak to the synergy that exists between what Richard is describing on the ground in terms of empowering local communities to gather and present evidence of the harms that they've experienced and effectively communicate that evidence, the synergy that exists between that and the international financial campaigning around this project, they're critical elements that really feed into one another. So without this strong, rigorous evidence of what's happening on the ground, it would not be possible for us to effectively advocate at the international level towards banks, multinational banks and insurance and reinsurance companies. So we need that level of clear evidence. And it's more effective, of course, if the voice of the communities are being amplified to speak directly to these financial institutions about what's being done on the ground and also their fears around what could happen if the project moves ahead and reaches full construction and implementation. In terms of your question about milestones, what comes to mind in terms of the international financial advocacy is back in the spring of 2021. That's sort of when the campaigning around the banks really launched in earnest. So prior to that, what we had done was we did this financial mapping, as I described earlier, looking at how the project would be financed. And once we found out that they needed this massive project loan, what we did together, my organization together with a partner called Bank Track and some Ugandan NGOs as well, we looked into who are the banks that have existing financial relationships with Total and with CNOOC, the two major companies involved. Which are the banks that have provided corporate finance to those two companies, as well as project finance for other projects in other companies or in other countries led by Total or CNOOC? Because, of course, these are the most likely banks that the project developers will go to ask to join this project loan. So based on that research, we came up with a list of commercial bank targets. And in the spring of 2021, I think it was March 2021, we really launched this campaign targeting all of those banks, calling on them to make a public commitment not to finance the pipeline. And when we launched it, what we did was write an open letter to all of these banks and circulated it among international, regional African and East African and local organizations. And ultimately, over 260 civil society organizations signed on to that open letter. And it was posted online. We got a lot of media attention about this open letter. And that was the first sort of major public international action targeting these potential financiers of the project. Following that open letter, we had a slew of public statements come back to us from these banks that didn't want to be associated with this project. So they came back and they said, no, we're not involved in the EACOP project. We have no plans to finance this project. And notably, several major French banks made a public statement at the time. I think it was a few months after that open letter came out. 3 major French banks, which were the top financiers of Total. So the banks that have given Total really the most support and the most money. Even those French banks came out and said, we've looked into this project. We think it's not a project we want to be associated with. Can you please stop naming us in association with this project? Can you take our name off of your campaign website? Because we're not going to finance this thing. And ultimately we did that. And then from there, as Isabel said, it's really really been a snowball effect of the more banks and the more insurance companies come out and say, no, we're not involved. We have no plans to be involved in this project. It serves to put pressure on the other banks and insurance companies that are staying quiet and haven't yet made a public statement. So as Isabel mentioned, since that initial open letter and the launch of that finance campaign in spring of 2021, up until now, we've had 27 major commercial banks from North America, Europe, Japan publicly state that they're not going to finance EACOP. And similarly, on the insurance side, 28 major multinational insurance and reinsurance companies make similar public commitments. So those are the major milestones that come to mind.
Yeah, amazing. And especially, the mention that the communities are now on board, they're beginning to get the sense that what was promised and what there's a significant gap in between. So I'm looking into a sort of a crystal ball into the future. There's been a lot of work here, all the constituent parties, local communities, international advocacy. So where do we go from here? What do you envision as, the next steps?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, now that we've been so successful in getting most of the major North American, European, and Japanese bank targets to step away from the project developers are looking increasingly to China and to the Middle East, according to what they say in the media at least, to finance this project. And it seems that they're looking to China as a sort of last resort because so many of the other potential financiers have withdrawn. So of course, our focus and our energy needs to go in that direction as well. Throughout the campaign for the last 3 or so years, we've also been engaging and targeting the Chinese actors. So it's not like we haven't been focusing on them and now suddenly we need to turn to them. We've been continuously giving them, information about the project's risks, writing letters from both international civil society as well as supporting local communities and project-affected people to write their own letters and their own petitions and sending them directly to the Chinese banks and other financial institutions in China. So we've been doing that work. But now, of course, we need to increase the pressure. We just need to continuously mobilize and energize the coalition to further our efforts and make the fight bigger and more impactful. So to give you an example, at the end of last year in 2023, November 2023, we organized a global day of action targeting Chinese potential financiers of the project. And this was an amazing effort that brought together organizers in Uganda. There was a protest outside of the Chinese embassies in Uganda, in Tanzania, in DRC, in South Africa, as well as in London, Paris, New York, and Washington, D.C. So all of these actions happened on the same day. And it was a coordinated day of action. So each of the protests sort of had a similar structure where local communities or climate activists approached either the Chinese embassy or the offices of some of the key Chinese targets. So ICBC, China Exim Bank, which is another major Chinese bank that could potentially lend to the project, and then Sinosure, which is a big, very powerful state-owned institution. It's a credit risk agency that basically needs to sign off on the project for Chinese banks to lend to the project. So those were the 3 targets of this day of action. And in each of the countries, activists approached either the offices of those institutions or the Chinese embassies and delivered a packet of materials, including advocacy letters sent by project-affected people, different analyses of the project's risks, both from civil society as well as from experts, independent experts, and essentially asked for a meeting with these institutions or the embassies to discuss the project. And so far, we haven't heard a response to our requests for meetings, but we're going to, of course, follow up on that. I won't reveal any precise next steps, but that's where our energy is focused. And Richard, I think, can speak.
So to add on what Corinne spoke, I think we have won now, even though they have not responded to us. But I can just mention about the 3 major wins from the 20th November action against the Chinese government involvement into EACOP. First of all, since we have dropped the deliverables on demanding Chinese to step away from EACOP, we have witnessed until now the China government and its associated financial and insurance companies, they have not yet done any major step concerning funding the EACOP. But second thing, We have seen Total. They declared publicly that they are going to reassess the land acquisition process in Tanzania and Uganda. So, and the third thing is that just to show our stance in that we don't have any confidence on Total to do reassessment on land acquisition process in Tanzania and Uganda. And our major stance is that Total should abandon EACOP project completely.
Amazing progress. Issa, I mean, just building up on this, it's been significant progress. Then for you, what do you envision as sort of the next steps, especially, I mean, for all the constituent parties? There's the citizens, there is the state agencies, there's these funding partners. I mean, what is your sense of where we go from here and how to build up on the progress so far?
Yes, so there's an upcoming moments that people can join in to support the campaign. So from February 26th to March 3rd, we're organizing the first ever global spotlight on the role of the insurance industry in the climate crisis and support to fossil fuels. And during that week, we'll be spotlighting specifically also the EACOP project to pressure insurers that haven't rolled it out yet to drop the support to the project to get more wins. So we're going to have communities from all over the globe, from over 20 countries on all continents coming together to demand that the insurance industry stop supporting fossil fuels, respects human rights, and actively supports a just transition. And how people can get involved, there's many ways. So they can either join an action that's taking place. They can go on the Global Insure Future websites and the Take Action section. There's all the details. So there's an action map, so they can see if there's activities happening in their country and city. They can organize their own action and events. They can join the digital actions. There's going to be multiple digital actions specifically around EACOP. And they can also amplify on social media the actions that are taking place from across the globe and tag insurance companies to have their voices heard. So basically, it's a momentum for us to continue the pressure and to have people from across the globe really pushing together, voicing their demands. So this is a next moment that people can join. And I think the thing here is really to continue keeping the pressure up and having more and more people behind the demands to stop EACOP and push for the solutions.
Thank you. Thank you, Issa. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Richard. Always a pleasure. And I mean, it's amazing progress that has been made. And all from us, thank you and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much for having us.
You can catch this conversation on Spotify, SoundCloud, and follow us on social media at Stop EACOP.